there was an acceptance of violence on a scale that we find quite strange and striking.
Then, as now, it has captured people's imagination that a small man, a weak man, or an old man can defeat a younger, stronger, more violent man.
Human bodies are just as vulnerable as they ever were, so armour is still really important.
Man, the naked ape, a relatively slow, weak and vulnerable animal, has come to dominate the planet. How? Well, one reason is that we've used our brains to find ways of protecting ourselves from both predatory animals and human enemies. We've developed weapons, defensive clothing and defended settlements, and above all, we've learnt to cooperate with each other in societies. But these societies themselves have proved prey to violence from within. And so for much of our history, we've had to use our brains to find ways of countering this threat too. For if violence is in our nature, and history seems to suggest that it is, then this is balanced by another of our deepest instincts, the instinct to defend ourselves. Early man is a mysterious figure. What little evidence there is offers the experts only a few clues. And even with the latest scientific methods, piecing these clues together needs some guesswork to form a picture of how man struggled to exist. Early man inhabited a very dangerous and threatening world. To stay alive, he had to learn to defend himself. Archaeologists believe that 500,000 years ago, Europe was teeming with wild and dangerous animals. Recent discoveries from Boxgrove, a site in southern Britain, revealed that this environment was even more threatening than we previously understood. Man's struggle to survive meant protecting himself from large animals, far more powerful and more aggressive.
Early people had to live alongside very dangerous large animals. Even in Britain, 500,000 years ago, the people at a site like Boxgrove were living close to lions, hyenas, wolves, maybe saber-toothed cats, elephants, rhinoceros. There was a whole array of very large, dangerous mammals. I think people a lot of the time obviously would have kept out of their way, but when they needed food, yes, they had to get close to these animals, either to hunt them or to scavenge from animals that had been killed by other carnivores such as lions.
Man's need and a desire for meat drove him to find effective ways of killing the animals around him, much earlier than experts previously believed.
Although man's eaten meat for a long time, he's not really a professional carnivore. So what he hasn't got is teeth and claws like other animals have, with which he can do damage to other species or indeed to his own. His eyes and ears aren't terribly good, and he can't run very fast. So if he's dealing with animals who've got acute sense of sight, acute hearing, and can run very quickly, he has got real problems. So what early man has to do is develop weapons to defend himself with.
Recent excavations are giving scientists new insights into these early weapons.
What I'm holding here is something that's called a hand axe. This one was made from flint, and it's from a British site called Swanscombe. It's about 400,000 years old.
But many experts have always believed that man's earliest weapons were simpler still, probably made of wood. Until recently, the chances of finding any surviving examples seemed unlikely.
We don't often find things like this in the archaeological record. Most often we find stone tools and weapons, but occasionally we get preservation of wood material. And this is part of a wooden spear that was found at Clacton. And it's about 300,000 years old, and it's made from yew wood. It's been shaved down and made to a point at this end. And people argued for a long time about whether it was part of a complete spear. Some people thought it might be a digging stick for digging up plant materials. But now we have examples of these from Germany at 400,000 years that are beautifully made complete javelins. So we think it probably was the end of one of these javelins, and it would have been used to throw at game, and also in some cases the shorter ones would have been used for stabbing, thrusting at animals at close quarters.
Further research has revealed animals were not the only threat. Early man had another aggressor.
When we get into the last 100,000 years, we do find some evidence of what might be construed as violence. There's a Neanderthal skeleton from Iraq that's maybe 50,000 years old, and one of those Neanderthals has an injury in the rib area that looks like it was made by a spear point. But of course, whether that was done by another Neanderthal or whether it was done in a hunting accident, we can't be sure. And there are also examples of human bones with cut marks on them. And here we've got human skeletons that look like they've been systematically butchered, dismembered. They've got cut marks on them made by stone tools, produced by other humans. And this raises the possibility even of cannibalism. Of course, whether they were killed violently or whether that was done after they died a natural death, we can't be sure. But certainly this was also something that was happening, and you could certainly interpret that as being possible violence between human groups.
To avoid violence and possibly cannibalism, the choice was simple: run, resist, or attack. To survive, early humans learnt quickly to use their hunting weapons to protect themselves. Perhaps violence is in our nature, but self-preservation is one of our deepest instincts. Humans were facing new threats from increasing numbers of their own species. They had to defend themselves.
The jury's out on whether early man was aggressive or not. I think we can be sure that really quite quickly he develops the means of attack and defence. And this is tied up with him becoming a creature who lives not on his own but in groups. And soon we see early man living in groups, equipped with ways of protecting himself through animal hides and carrying weapons and using these weapons for the hunt, and then to use almost the same tactics for the hunt in his campaigns against his fellow men. So very quickly, he's armed and aggressive.
As these human groups developed, so hunters settled on the land and became farmers. In time, this produced a surplus of food that allowed for greater specialization, and villages, towns, and cities developed. Civilization had arrived. People soon learnt they had to defend these settlements and their surplus food against both animal and human attack. So early cities often had walls of mud or stone. Villages sometimes had wooden stockades. Over the centuries, it's not been unusual for us to build walls around our communities to keep dangers out. And for most of the time, these have been fairly successful in keeping external enemies away. But on the other hand, they've given no protection whatsoever against the internal enemies, the crime and violence which has been endemic within the communities themselves. Indeed, it's possible that by constraining the communities within them, such walls have helped to create the grossly overcrowded conditions in which violent crime flourishes.
Looking back from the beginning of the 21st century, times past were undoubtedly violent. Just go back 100 years to the end of Victoria's reign. An individual was twice as likely to be killed then than now. Go back to the reign of Elizabeth I, and an individual was 5 times as likely to be killed as his or her counterpart in Victorian England. But if you go back to medieval times, to the 13th century, then the chances of being killed were 20 times higher than those facing an individual today. There is no doubt that these were more violent times. There was an acceptance of violence on a scale that we find quite strange and striking.
By the 12th and 13th centuries, the threat of personal danger in towns was constant. Dark, narrow streets brought threats to the innocent citizen, threats that were often sudden and extremely violent. Some of these criminal attacks, unexceptional at the time, are detailed in surviving court and legal records. They are telling examples to us of medieval city life. William de Rothwell, walking quietly in St Nicholas's Lane, London, was assaulted by several men, one of them armed with a longbow, which he shot at the fleeing victim.
If you were living in a medieval town, you were subject to, particularly the big towns, of course, you were subject to all the discharged soldiers, unemployed, the vagabonds, the tramps, who were quite ready to attack you if they thought they could get away with it.
The gang was well armed with swords, daggers, quarterstaff and a bow. Defending oneself against such attacks was a major problem. Any criminal armed with a weapon could roam the dark streets looking for victims and sometimes kill for the sake of a few pence.
The court records of the time give a good indication of the levels of violence and the way in which all members of society could be victims or perpetrators of violence.
William de Rothwell ran, was wounded by an arrow and finally cornered with nowhere to go. He turned to face his assailants, who set upon him. The Rothwell sword was useless against such a concentrated and ferocious assault. The court records of the time state the attack had taken place on Sunday the 23rd of November, 1302.
Basically, I think your main defence was avoiding trouble. You didn't go in certain areas, somewhat like today in some places. If you were attacked, the best defence was to run. If you couldn't run, then you did the best you could with your fists, your feet, or your dagger, possibly your quarterstaff. If you were, shall we say, a little more up the social scale, you might well have carried a sword. Lots of people did.
And they continued to do so for centuries. For those rich enough to afford one, a sword was both a status symbol and a fashion statement. But above all, it was a weapon to be used when necessary for self-defense. Throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, masters of arms plied their trade, teaching men how to handle themselves and their weapons in a life and death struggle, teaching them guards, attacks and parries, teaching them how to use even their cloak when necessary, and teaching them that this was not a game, that they must use any method they could to win, however ungentlemanly it might seem. In any age, it was no safer outside the city than within it. The countryside was equally dangerous, and honest people, even visiting a neighbouring village, would seldom venture on a journey unless they were well armed and prepared to protect themselves. No citizen in the Middle Ages could afford to give up arms when travelling was such a dangerous business.
The carrying of weapons was commonplace throughout society in the 13th or 14th century. There was a toleration of violence. It was acceptable to settle certain matters in a violent way.
Many innocent medieval travellers ran the risk of running into groups of well-armed vagrants or discharged soldiers who lived off the land and any unfortunates they ran into.
There's a range of rather ambiguous implements, shears, billhooks, chisels, which technically were part of the job, but were quite often used to inflict serious injury upon people. There was easy access to implements that could kill or maim.
A billhook was a typical example of an adapted agricultural implement used as a weapon. Ordinary travellers often carried a quarterstaff. It was both a walking stick and a weapon. A simple piece of wood about 2 meters long and generally taller than the man who wielded it, it was both adaptable and reliable, but needed practice to be used effectively. Swords were not common. They were expensive and usually owned by the rich or royal officers and soldiers. And even if the poor could afford a sword, there were laws prohibiting the lower classes from carrying them. There was a general acceptance that to protect yourself, you needed to carry some sort of defense. Many would have learnt how to use the simple stick and know how to wield it against attack.
But it was not just the ruffians who attacked. Gentlemen themselves were violent. So violence was not simply the prerogative of the lower classes. It was something that ran through all sectors of society.
In the 17th century, the quarterstaff was usually seen as a peasant's weapon. But it wasn't only the lower classes that knew how to use it. In 1625, an English gentleman in Spain at a council of war demonstrated its defensive uses. He agreed to be attacked by two Spaniards armed with swords and daggers, and showed he could beat them off using only his quarterstaff. Sword points and daggers aimed at the eye and the body could be countered by skillful handling, using the length, the middle and the ends, quickly to block and deflect the attack. And when the quarterstaff was used in attack, it could deliver a heavy blow to disable and floor the attacker. The quarterstaff, an adaptable weapon, was a useful means of self-defense for all classes. This simple stick could be highly successful even against the sword, the most popular weapon of the military and upper classes. But it wasn't only in Europe that the simple stick was used for self-defense. As in the West, so in the East, and especially in Japan, techniques of self-defense were practiced by the warrior caste. Today, ancient fighting skills that were developed hundreds of years ago are still used and are practiced with the same dedication and discipline. The Japanese self-defense masters devised and developed a series of techniques that teach an unarmed man how to disarm an opponent, even if he's threatening him with a knife or dagger.
Traditionally, there is no distinction between unarmed combat and armed combat in Japan. And indeed, the unarmed combat forms which are practiced and studied today in Japan derive from traditions born from armed combat. So methods of disarming swordsmen, which are practiced in Aikido and Judo today, of course, were originated in the sword fencing schools.
These are a series of key movements that were first developed in fencing schools over 700 years ago.
It was quite a shock, in the 19th century when Yukio Tani, a diminutive Japanese judo man, came to this country and was able to take on all comers at wrestling and defeat them with ease.
It is this particular quality of Japanese martial arts that the West finds so fascinating. That an individual can be taught to overcome an aggressive assailant.
Then, as now, it has captured people's imagination that a small man, a weak man, or an old man can defeat a younger, stronger, more violent man.
To Western eyes, these are just unarmed self-defense techniques. But in the East, they think about them differently.
In a way, I suppose you could say that self-defense is a misnomer, because the ultimate aim of the Japanese martial arts is to indulge in combat without regard to one's own life.
The sword was the Japanese warrior's personal weapon. Practicing for warfare with the sword was a daily routine for the samurai warriors of the 11th and 12th centuries.
Warfare in Japan for virtually the past 1,000 years has been largely fought between members of the hereditary class, and the man in the street, as it were, had no place in this. The traditional military class in Japan, who numbered perhaps 6 or 7% of the population, went armed every day of their lives. And indeed, during the Edo period, they carried two swords. The shorter they would wear at home, and even carried to their bedchamber. The longer one they would wear out of doors. So their devotion to the military training was a very, very, very much more intense thing than we can possibly imagine.
The dedication the ancient samurai warriors brought to their fighting skills, even when practicing with wooden swords, was much more than technical expertise. Their mental approach, the state of their mind at the moment of attack, was also very important.
Their whole life was devoted to the study of the military arts. But these fighting arts became nurtured in the spirit of Buddhism, and particularly Zen Buddhism. The highest spiritual point for a samurai was to get beyond the mistaken concepts of life and death, beyond the concept of grasping for one's own life. And such people who'd attained such a spiritual level, of course, made very, very frightful opponents.
Move and counter-move were practiced and practiced, so they became automatic, leaving the mind free to plan the strategy of the fight and to focus on that spiritual dimension.
It is the spiritual advantage which counts, and the martial arts developed into training for this spiritual advantage. And this spiritual advantage, of course, eventually became more spiritual than combative, if you like.
The Nikko Toshogu Shrine is one of Japan's most important, dedicated to the first modern shogun. Here, young Shinto priests are quietly preparing to practice the exhilarating and dynamic art of kendo, a unique and very traditional style of Japanese fencing.
It's through kendo swordplay, with its spiritual aspects, that one can actually study something which is beyond combat itself.
Kendo is one of the most popular of all Japanese martial arts. It is swordplay, but using bamboo swords rather than real ones.
You know that you're not going to be killed, so you can exert utmost aggression and violence against the opponent, while at the same time imagining that the bamboo sword which he holds is a real sword. It's perhaps a bit artificial, but it's the nearest one will get to such a spiritual edge, if you like, other than actually fighting with a real sword, which I certainly don't recommend.
The armour has an unfamiliar look to Western eyes. The jacket, or kendo-gi, is cotton. The split trousers, the hakama, give complete freedom of movement, and the helmet, or men, protects the throat, shoulders, and the back of the head. Hands and hips are also covered. The priests are taught that awareness of the opponent and knowing what he may do next is the key discipline. This is achieved through clear thought and a determined spirit. The noise the fighters make is also traditional. The shout or ki charges the fighter's adrenaline and boosts energy, concentrating the mind and body at the moment of impact. Etiquette and order return at the end of the fight, and in the traditional Japanese way, each bows to the shrine and then to each other. Over the centuries in Japan, simple sword practice with wooden sticks has developed into a complex martial art which teaches self-discipline, self-knowledge and courage. In Europe too, for as long as men have used swords for self-defense, they have practiced with wooden sticks. But there, no spiritual dimension or continuing martial art has developed. Instead, practice has stayed just practice, or become a sport, an opportunity to show courage with little physical danger. In Europe in the 18th century, many young gentlemen about town regularly participated in practice sessions to keep themselves amused and perhaps win money on a wager. The left elbow is raised for protection, while the left hand holds the end of a scarf. To win the bet, one of the contestants had to draw an inch of blood. Once blood had been drawn, the fight ended. The bet won or lost. And with a friendly handshake, the two men went to the tavern to discuss other matters. The need for gentlemen to be skilled in the arts of swordsmanship was soon to be literally blown away. A coach travelling through 18th century England was an easy target for a new breed of armed criminal who would lay in wait in sparsely populated parts of the countryside to rob innocent passengers who frequently carried valuables on their person. No one needed long hours of practice to use a pistol. It was a matter of minutes to learn to load and fire a gun. A fallen tree across the road was enough to halt the coach and warn the driver and passengers of the dangers to come. An attack from a highwayman. A loaded and cocked pistol at close range was a powerful persuader. Wealthy passengers must have had a continuing sense of danger. Nothing, it seemed, could halt the march of crime.
Travel during the 17th and 18th century was dangerous, and almost every coach would have carried some sort of weapon. The blunderbuss was the most popular. This is a fairly typical one, main feature being this expanding barrel. This makes it easy to load. Contrary to popular belief, they were not loaded with stones and pieces of glass. This is a typical load, the size set down by the post office for the Royal Mail coaches, and would have been carried by almost all the coaches. The expanding barrel made it very noisy, very frightener, and also the size was threatening, much more so than an ordinary pistol.
Our tests with small lead shot show just how effective the blunderbuss was. Every highwayman must have known the damage a blunderbuss could inflict on him, and innocent travellers must have gained some small sense of security from the presence of a weapon powerful enough to change a highwayman's plans and force him to beat a hasty retreat.
These were carried through most of the 17th and right through to the early part of the 18th century. And even the later stagecoaches of America, the scattergun is really just a modern form of the old blunderbuss.
Many wealthy travellers must have armed themselves with discreet weapons. But for some gentlemen, there were growing doubts as to whether this was the best way to defend themselves.
By the 19th century, I think it's true to say that violence was no longer as acceptable. Certainly among middle and upper class men, it was considered unmanly to resort to fists and so forth. As a consequence, the carrying of sidearms, as it were, does decline. Duelling, very obviously, becomes outlawed in the early 19th century. However, there is still a tradition, if you like, of carrying weapons secreted upon the person.
Growing concerns about personal safety led to a number of new and unusual weapons. Defending yourself during the Industrial Revolution was a growth business. Part of the problem in 19th century Britain was the rapid increase in the populations of the cities and a growing divide between the rich and the poor.
In Victorian times, people who were well off looked well off. Gentlemen dressed well. The poor looked poor. They were generally shabbily dressed. And so for any lady or gentleman out walking, particularly in the evening or in rough areas, they were something of a target for the criminal. And this is a purse pistol, a tiny pinfire revolver with a little folding trigger so it doesn't snag. It's a 6-shot gun. All you needed to do was pull the trigger, and away it went. Although of tiny caliber, it's only about 4 millimeters. It would have been an extremely effective weapon and very deadly at close range, and it would have been an ideal small pistol for a woman to be carrying. This is a concealed weapon of a slightly different type. It is in fact a purse. It's a working purse. That's where you put your money. But it's a purse that has a sting in the tail. It's not entirely what it appears to be. That's a barrel, and that's a trigger. And to fire the pistol that's concealed in it, you simply pull the trigger. It's a German patent, Frankenau, of about 1875. And in the reverse of it, it contains a tiny pinfire revolver, which is a 6-shot weapon. And although of quite small caliber, it would in fact have been quite effective. Nobody would be expecting a lady to produce a pistol that was capable of firing bullets, and any potential mugger would probably be extremely surprised at suddenly having a fusillade of small lead bullets coming towards him.
In the 1850s and 1860s, polite society panics over an outbreak of street attacks. The garroting is basically another form of street robbery, but the modus operandi was for the would-be thief to seize his victim from behind with a cord, to half strangle him, and while in that state his accomplice would then rifle the pockets of the poor unfortunate. We then find, in a moment of whimsy, Punch recommending that gentlemen should wear spiked collars and spikes on their elbows so they can defend themselves from ungentlemanly attacks from behind.
This was an anti-garroting pistol, which is a wonderful Ball's patent of about 1850. It could be worn on the front of your belt like that, but because it's an anti-garroting pistol and generally you were garroted from behind, the chances are it would be mounted in the small of your back and held on a leather belt. It's a 1-inch barrel with a 50 caliber ball inside it, and you had a string looped through the trigger. When it was on your belt behind you, the string simply tucked around the front of your trousers, and when the evil thug leapt upon you, you simply pulled the string and it fired the bullet at very close range, and presumably gave him such an unpleasant fright that he dropped off your back and ran away screaming. In fact, the bullet at the sort of range we're talking about would be quite deadly, and although it looks quite amusing, it would have been a very efficient weapon. But we have absolutely no idea whether they were bought simply for amusement factor or whether any were used seriously. I somehow doubt that any of them were used seriously for no other reason than sitting down with this on your back would make you very, very uncomfortable in a fairly short period of time.
The 19th century American West had fewer cramped and crowded cities, but shared many of the same social problems as those facing Victorian Britain. More and more firearms in production meant more people had access to them for their own defence. And although many chose not to carry them, most people believed you had to defend yourself somehow.
I'll finish you, you damn son of a bitch!
In a frontier saloon, the temptation to use one of the new weapons was hard to resist. A poor aim and an unreliable gun saved the day. In the 19th century, there were moves to do something to stop increasing crime and put an end to the lawlessness of the past. The Lawman is the end of a long story that had begun centuries before in England, when the king was given an impossible task.
The king was responsible for the peace of the whole realm, but obviously he couldn't do it on his own, so he appointed a number of chief officers, if you like, known as reeves, and each of those was responsible for an area of the country known as a shire. So he was the king's representative, the shire reeve, and he was responsible for looking after any problems, collection of taxes, law and order, and it's from the shire reeve that the term sheriff grew. Again, a man responsible for law and order in a certain area.
The law was beginning to impose itself more strongly on society. But enforcing the law remained for many centuries largely the responsibility of honest and upright citizens. Rembrandt's 17th century masterpiece, The Night Watch, gives us a detailed portrait of the men who saw themselves as the guardians and keepers of law and order. Men of prestige, men with a stake in the success of the city, men with something to lose if the law was not upheld.
This was a group of the citizens who took it in turns, and they were supposed to parade all round the main streets, probably armed with a halberd, carrying a lantern or perhaps a stick. And anybody found out in the streets would be stopped, and unless they could prove they had a legitimate reason for being there, they were arrested, taken along to the watch house, and detained until the following morning.
Rembrandt's famous painting gives a rare insight into one of the origins of the modern police force. Taking responsibility for law and order, these worthy citizens of Amsterdam had gathered together and armed themselves according to their social status, with a variety of weapons to defend themselves and their fellow men against theft and violence. It was not until 200 years later, in England, that a full-time body of men paid to protect society came into existence. And it took a change in society's views to bring it about. In early 19th century Britain, a police force emerged.
Interpersonal violence is no longer as acceptable as it has been in the past. There is a desire for a greater standard of personal security, and the police can be seen as a response to these changing expectations.
The new officers had to wear their reinforced top hat and tailcoats at all times. On their cuffs, distinctive white bands indicated when they were on duty to help and to protect the public.
When Sir Robert Peel introduced the legislation that established the so-called New Police in London, he was determined to have a force of men who were distinct, uniform, but quite different from either the army or the yeomanry. So there is a quite conscious decision from the outset that the new police will be unarmed except insofar as they carry a truncheon, which was seen as a weapon of self-defence.
Part of the early policeman's equipment was the decorated wooden truncheon, a seemingly old-fashioned weapon for a new force, especially as the peelers were often up against criminals with firearms. But the stick was issued with a particular and practical use in mind.
A truncheon can be used in one hand while you apprehend a victim. Using a musket, which after all many of the army used, a musket required two hands and reduced the mobility of the policeman, reduced his ability to apprehend, and indeed could put him at risk should that gun fall into the hands of others. So there was a sense in using the truncheon. And it's worth noting that although this is supposedly a defensive weapon, this is a fairly substantial piece of wood which, when wielded by a 6-foot policeman, could inflict quite considerable damage.
The truncheon has moved smoothly into the 21st century. The police are still issued with it today. The design is different, but the purpose is the same: to defend the police officer.
In many respects, the baton today, although technologically a more sophisticated instrument, is, in a sense, merely a continuation of that tradition that goes back to the late 1820s, when the myth of the unarmed policeman first was created.
The police baton's design has been modified and updated in the United States. Here it's being used by the West Yorkshire Police Force in self-defence training. As they exercise using the baton, they shout "Get back" at their attackers. Many of these routines have their origins in ancient self-defence techniques from both Western and Eastern martial arts. The positions, movements and counter-movements the police adopt have been designed to minimise the officer's vulnerability to violent assault at very close quarters. The attacker will instinctively always target the weakest parts of the body. These modern defensive moves find parallels with the defensive moves of the past: the Japanese wooden sword and simple medieval stick or quarterstaff. But ultimately, in the 21st century, the modern police officer needs to protect his body with stronger defences to deal with a range of new and deadly threats. Ancient and modern self-defence techniques with the simple stick are now coupled with the latest technological defences in an attempt to keep the modern policeman fully protected.
Armour was always about protecting the vulnerable human body, often in a military context. Human bodies are just as vulnerable as they ever were. And the risks that people face in, for example, police, internal security, not to mention military situations, are even more varied than they ever were. So armour is still really important. Not only do police forces need it, but we'll see increasingly armies being unwilling to commit soldiers to battle without giving them the maximum possible protection. And often that means armour.
The manufacture of modern armour is a long way from the roaring forges and constant hammering of the medieval armourer's workshop. The modern armour produced in this secret factory is woven like fabric and is resilient enough to protect against high-powered ammunition. It is a strong and effective self-defence material. Layers of fabric are cut for jackets. The hands of the operative protected by one of the most ancient defences, iron mail. Medieval body defences too were often layers of thin material sewn together to give a thickness and absorbency that cushioned blows from swords and sometimes even spears and arrows. Another form of body armour that owes its inspiration to the past are jackets reinforced with titanium plates to provide a bulletproof protection. These body armours can stop powerful ammunition even at close range.
In some respects, armour design has come full circle. A lot of early armour consisted of things like jacks and brigandines, which were metal plates in a fabric jacket.
This is a very rare example of a Tudor jack or jacket. Very few have survived because the fabric usually rotted away and sometimes little remained but a handful of rusty metal plates. The jack, like its modern counterpart, perfectly fulfilled the three basic principles that govern the design of all successful armour. It was light, it was flexible, and it gave protection.
Modern armour consists of the same sort of thing. Very often there are plates which might be metal or might be ceramic, encased in some form of fabric or plastic. So the idea is very similar, achieving self-defence by putting hard substances into some flexible fabric.
Modern armour provides front and rear protection with titanium plates, just as the metal plates of the Tudor jack did. Testing modern armour is a very technical business. Photographically slowing the speed of the ammunition and recording the effects is a science in itself. These are some of the results. A Chinese armour-piercing incendiary bullet has little effect on the protective jacket, although the explosion and afterburn would cause bruising. Another jacket easily absorbs the energy of the .357 ammunition. The impact is spread through the layers of material and quickly dissipated. This is the level of protection a modern police officer needs against today's high-powered weapons. Stripping away the layers of protection that have defended us down the centuries from a violent world that is as old as humankind itself, we see that perhaps violence is part of our nature. But from the moment a human first picked up a stick as a weapon, it has always been balanced by another, stronger, deeper instinct, the instinct to defend ourselves.